Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. You know, it must be crazy when people join this channel for the very first time. They have no idea what's going on. They're like, this guy's done videos before? Who's this guy? All right. Bermuda Triangle, as promised. Now, if you're like me, and I think in the modern age with younger kids, you're not like me, let me know. Back in the 70s and 80s, they really built up and sensationalized this area of the Atlantic between Puerto Rico, the Florida Keys, roughly, and the island of Bermuda that's way north. The phrase was coined in 1964, and it was a science fiction magazine that actually coined the phrase. I'm going to try to say the name of this right. It's Orgossi magazine. It could be Orgossi because the Y should make the O long. Sometimes Y, you know. So up until that point, things were happening in this area, but no one had really, coined the phrase Bermuda Triangle until the sci-fi mag did it, which is pretty cool, I guess. They used to call them the Devil's Islands and the Isles of the Devils because of the fact that people would travel from Europe and not know really anything about tropical environments or the indigenous life that lives in those areas. And so they land on this mysterious island of Bermuda. Again, this isn't about Bermuda itself, but Bermuda is a wild location. I had no idea until I did research on this. But we'll get to that one second. But they would land on this island and all of a sudden hear all these amazing sounds. And there's the cacao bird. I don't know if it's cacao or cacao. And it would, screech at night. And they didn't know where it was. And it's a rare bird that only exists on Bermuda Island and probably neighboring little teeny islands. And so imagine you've been to a lot of places and you never heard that sound before. All right. Plus, apparently, as the conquistadors kept coming over to America, one of the classic things they did in America was, in South America, was that they were smart to bring pigs. Because pigs procreate pretty quickly, and boy, are they tasty, right? So these pigs would get loose as well on the island, and so you'd hear the screeching of pigs. And so just kind of turn into this spooky location way before we have our modern day problems with this area of the ocean. Now, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of theories as to what's going on in this region, from natural things that we're going to talk about all the way up to like the crazier, more open-minded theories of like aliens. And I will say that I watched a ton of videos. I did a moderate amount of reading, obviously Wikipedia and that kind of stuff, and just, browse some theories. And it's very interesting how it's kind of coming together with a bunch of really fairly decent suggestions of how things could occur. Some totally surprising ones to me, which are very scientifically possible and, very realistic in the laboratory. But what I found interesting was that when they start talking about UFOs taking people away, which no one's ever said they saw a UFO as a part of one of these disappearances, you'll hear the same person who's throwing all this other stuff at you kind of say, well, it doesn't make any sense why UFOs would be in this region and why they would take anybody away. There's some reasons. I got my hoodie on today because let's see. It's a nice warm 44 degrees out. So now, depending on who you talk to, you get all kinds of different reports about how much has gone wrong in this area and how other governments view this area as potentially a threat or not a threat. So you hear just completely different things. The lowest number I've heard was 2,000 ships, 150 aircraft. The highest number I've heard is 3,000 ships and 150 aircraft. So the aircraft's pretty locked down. But in terms of ships, pretty bad. 3,000 since they started tracking this way back in the 1800s. I'm going to kick off with the ships because chronologically they go first. And Christopher Columbus, who's technically the first person to have the capability of writing his language down in a first world source, from a first world source, saw some things as he was journeying over here. But apparently to this day, 5 ships a year disappear in this area. That sounds pretty significant. However, I will tell you right off the bat, apparently, according to one of the sources, the United States military / Navy, I should say, has never earmarked Bermuda region, that Bermuda Triangle region, as being an inordinate threat. It's not even in the top 10. Apparently, it's not even in the top 20. But the reasons that have been prophesized or theorized, I should say, as to why these ships disappear are capable of sinking just about anything, from an aircraft carrier all the way down to any naval ship that's out there. So it would seem as if this would be definitely on the list, and not necessarily for anything enemy combatant or UFOs, but for all the natural things that I'm going to share with you that I discovered. Now, because there are thousands of missing ships and hundreds of missing planes, my review of some of the disappearances is going to be fairly abbreviated, simply because it gets really boring really fast. But the difference in species of these disappearances is where some of the myth gets tempered, and then some of the myth gets launched, if you will. Now, Christopher Columbus, depending on who you hear tell the story, he was sailing from Spain all the way down to what ended up being, wasn't it San Salvador or something like that? I was thinking the first island he landed on, named after his mother. I think that's the way the movie 1492 talked about it. I'm not a giant Christopher Columbus fan, because once you really get into his history, it's pretty clear he was really taking advantage of the fact that he was away from home. He had a military that would protect him. And so, who knows? They'll make claims about the guy, and, what am I going to fly to Spain to try to figure out whether or not it's true or not? Or why would they want to take a crap on a person that I think is a hero in Spain? Don't know. I mean, they didn't get to keep America, so maybe he's a traitor. I don't know. Apparently, Christopher Columbus dies in Florida, South Florida, hiding from the authorities in Spain for all kinds of stuff, from taking gold away from the Queen, to pedophilia, to raping and murdering the locals. I mean, it got bad. Now, there are different anomalies that he supposedly noted in his log coming from Spain. If you look at the log versus the time that the log entry was made and how fast we know his ships moved, virtually 90% of everything, if not 95% of everything that he reported in his log as an anomaly, was in the waters far preceding anything in this Bermuda Triangle, which again is the northern Bermuda Island down to Puerto Rico over to Florida. However, when he gets really close to land, which is strange because it's not the Florida Keys, but he said he had seen lights in the sky. And then what people forget is that in his own log, 2 hours later, they hit land. So what they think he might have been seeing, if it wasn't just interesting plasma storms that perhaps do not occur in Spain. I've never been to Spain, I don't know. I know that in the United States, where I come from, in Kansas, we have storms that are like unreal. We have lots of tornadoes, we have black clouds, and I mean black clouds that'll show up in the middle of summer and monsoon us. But he may have been seeing lights, which were technically just fires in the hills away from his boat. And of course, being at sea for an extended period of time, you would have to assume that the senses would be extremely powerful because you're in a deprivation situation. So they dragged Christopher Columbus into this. And the year was 1492, October 11th. Now, the interesting thing is like, I'll hear notes about, for instance, leaping forward to 2015. There was a vessel with a bunch of cargo stuff on it. And it was called the SS El Faro. It had 33 crew members on board. And they reported this, and I just watched this report that said this is like the most deadly one since this whole anomaly's been discovered. And maybe that's true from 1964. But you dial back to 1800 when the USS Pickering disappeared, headed towards Delaware from the Galapagos Islands, lost 90 people. Now, here's the thing about the ships that disappear. And here's what's interesting about the whole thing. Ships are disappearing like instantaneously, meaning whatever occurs to the ship is so sudden and so violent that captains don't have the chance to grab a radio and scream Mayday or ask for any help at all. It does happen, but a lot of times it doesn't matter if it's a giant tanker, a modern day shipping container kind of vehicle, or a ship back in 1800. These vehicles apparently get destroyed super quick. Another one, 1814. Remember the 39, which God bless their souls. I hope they're on a UFO going somewhere. Lost 140 people. Just disappears. Now, this area of the world is no mystery to most people in terms of the fact that most hurricanes are created off the coast of, off the coast of Africa, and then they head over to the Americas, and of course some go into the Gulf, some pound Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Bahamas and all those islands over there. Apparently, my layman's knowledge is that the less that your civilization goes vertical in terms of structures, the less you suffer from a hurricane. I know that shanty houses and stuff get knocked down, but it just seems like the bigger you are, the more you can run into some serious issues. The only hurricane that I remember scorching the earth was Andrew, way back when I was young. Katrina did a horrible thing, but that was mostly flooding issues, all of them being horrific. We have USS Wildcat gets knocked out in 1824. There's a dispute as to how many people passed from 14 to 31. And sometimes they will find the ship without the crew. Very interesting stuff. A lot of times they'll find the ship with partial crew and they will tell you what happened. They had a bilge pump that didn't work and that sort of thing. So I'm going to say this much. If you're terribly interested in all of the disappearances, I didn't find in all the research that I did that any one of the ships super duper stands out, except for the more modern ones, where they're cargo ships with a bunch of modern equipment, and they just totally disappear. And sometimes, they reappear with no crew on them. I mean, it's just the most bizarre thing. If a ship can survive and not end up on the bottom of the ocean, you would assume that someone could hide in a compartment. I mean, there's compartments inside ship bows that are completely waterproof. And so, there's some really interesting stuff. Now, let's touch on, briefly, Bermuda Island, because this is fascinating, and I never knew this, man. That island is sitting on the mushroom cap of a derelict, dead volcano that goes down approximately, I want to say the first drop-off is like 4,000 feet down. So this island has a volcano that goes up, and it seems to have spewed a bunch of volcanic rock that then created like a T, or like a mushroom top on the end of this, but very collapsed. Sort of one of your flat mushrooms. I'll show you guys pictures as I go along here. And the islands are on the top, and it's a fairly tiny group of islands. It's very lush. Obviously, when the settlers started coming in the 1600s, they were pretty terrified of what they were bumping into because they just didn't know. And then things calm down, place gets inhabited, and up until recently, you could get greeted by this gentleman, Johnny Barnes. This is black gentleman that would wave at you when you came to the island. He did it for a really, really long time, and so much so that they built a statue of him waving, and he stood next to the statue and he would wave at you. He's just this endearing man that, unfortunately, after 2016, we're not going to be able to see him anymore, except his statue, and I'm sure his spirit is running around the island. What a great little thing. But not too far away from the Bermuda Island, you have a 3-mile drop down to 15,000 feet. It's pretty huge for that area. So this is a very eccentric place. As well, I'm going to bleed in a little bit of ethereal theory in here because we're talking about an area of the Earth's crust that is extremely active. Now, even though there's a derelict volcano that Bermuda sits on top of, the area is reported to have pretty massive seismic shifting out there. And during a lot of this seismic shifting, we're going to have huge plumes, and I mean plumes probably the size of small islands of methane gas coming to the surface, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes here. Now, the thing that blows me away is that people who comment on UFO stuff ignorantly, it sort of, I just want people to say, I don't know. I don't study that stuff, and I have no theories there. Sounds far-fetched to me, but then I don't know, right? Instead, they kind of crap on anything and then move on, which always, it's really just a hubris that won't let go to qualify themselves. And so in the end, they kind of seem authoritative, but they're not looking at sort of some of the ocean theories from like Bill Cooper and other people. And I forgot what they call the UFOs in the water. But you have an area of the ocean that is volatile. You have an area that's very deep. And so if somebody was going to put a little observational base, a little abyss base on the bottom of the ocean, you would potentially put it in an area that's warm and that has this active area. And maybe you're the reason why it's active. Who knows, right? So I am still a believer in Bill Cooper when it comes to him seeing UFOs exit the ocean and re-enter the ocean. As he said, maybe everything he was told after that moment of his life when he got Q clearance within the 24-hour period of seeing these, along with other crewmen on the deck of this ship seeing it, along with the radar folks inside the ship saying they saw vehicles just suddenly appear next to the ship and fly away, and then 2 more come in and go into the ocean. It's too many people that saw these, and they're not the only people in the world that have ever seen these, to dismiss the fact that if you're going to be creating this environment, whatever it is, whether flat earth, matrix, you just happen to maintenance the earth, or you created us, or whatever, them being at the bottom of the ocean with technology seems like it might make sense. And who knows, it could be a proxy into something much more interesting. But there are just tons of these boat disappearances. Now, because we know hurricanes are there and there's all kinds of things, there are funnels, like water funnels that are like tornadoes on the water. Most of you have probably seen those in your lifetime, at least on TV. There's methane gas bubbles that could sink a ship. And you might think, what? What's going on? There was a little video I saw. It was like more of the official channel stuff, like BBC stuff. And there was a dude who was an expert in fluid mechanics. He has a plexiglass cylinder. He has a steel ball inside. simulating the boat hull, the displacement. And it's floating perfectly in the water. It's just a little bit above water. Most of it was underwater, but if it was a ship, and it just would have been like a normal sailboat in a simulation, this dude has rigged a bunch of tubes at the bottom to evenly distribute a tremendous amount of air bubbles, not necessarily methane, because it would be explosive in his laboratory. But it doesn't have anything to do with it being methane, but that leads us back to the fact that crude oil is not a fossil fuel. It's compressed methane gas, because it's one of the most ample things in the crust of the earth. And when you compress it, you simply exacerbate the chemistry signature of carbon and hydrogen. And the reason why we refine oil is to get it back towards its methane composite when it originated. But what it has to do with is just the bubbles. The displacement of a hull against ocean has to do with the fact that you're trapping air inside of a hull, and then you're trying to push that air down inside the ocean. When that occurs, it's got buoyance. It pushes back. When you see the ocean with tons of bubbles around the ship, you then pierce the density of water with bubbles. And so now, that pressure that's pushing down, the hull that's pushing down on the water, and the equation that makes buoyancy starts to disintegrate. Imagine this. I mean, this is like, if you know anything about deep sea, ocean, anything, even if you're just a fisherman out there, I think it's a little more terrifying with a small boat. But I guess this happening on a giant boat would be quadruple terrifying. You are out there sailing. There's a titanic shift below you, which you don't hear necessarily. And then here comes a football field-sized bubble of millions of little bubbles up and around your ship. And within seconds, your ship starts to fall to the bottom of the ocean, which could be up to 15,000 feet, 3 miles. Oh my God. And let's say it's at nighttime. Hell, if it's even a daytime, it might be even worse, right? You're just so lucidly going, oh my God, it's like the Kansas album cover, Ship is going, foof, right down into that hole. I think there's one that's like that. Now, waterspouts, as I said, is another one, but I have to say waterspouts would probably be very much on the realm of a smaller boat, you would imagine. One of the more recent theories that's going on here is what they're calling rogue waves. Now, rogue waves have been theorized for quite some time. And it's different than a tsunami, right? We know how a tsunami behaves. Something seismic happens off the coast, and that reels back a gigantic amount of water because a plate drops, creating more space inside the ocean to suck a huge volumetric amount of water out to sea. And everyone runs onto the sand where they've never stood before without water being over their head, and you pick up rocks and fish and everything, and you're like, this is great. And all of a sudden you look up and you're like, what's that? What's crazy about tsunamis, just as a small digression, is any of you've really looked into the 2004 tsunami, it's 280,000 people perish on many coasts. It is a terrifying, subtle way to die. You're like, the water's coming in. Wow, that's interesting. Oh, wait. But the one that's utterly horrific for my brain is all of the Japan videos from 2013. And yes, some of us believe it's a weapon that's being tested. But these rogue waves don't need a tsunami. Rogue waves, they're still theorizing exactly how they occur, but they're now capable of tracking them with satellite technology and aircraft. These waves average about 80 feet, which is an 8-story building, okay? Theoretically, they've managed to simulate them in water simulations, which we've got down pat. I mean, go see Pacific Rim, all the water's fake. Up to almost 200 feet tall. Wow. Huge. Now imagine, and some of the ways they're saying is that a lot of it could do with the contour of the bottom of the ocean, but you could have 2 fairly large waves combine and hit each other, and instead of canceling each other, they tend to multiply the frequencies up. You could have several small waves going in a direction, and they all multiply up into that beautiful piece of Japanese art. But imagine you're in a pretty damn big ship, and an 8 to 20 story wave. And you know how nature works, man. Nature will create like, oh, the biggest anaconda in the whole world is 20 feet. And then all of a sudden there's one that's like 1,000 feet long. I mean, nature does that, right? But you look up and you're like, oh my God, this is it. If we make it through this wave, which is a wave, you know, because most of you know that when you have a tsunami traveling across the Pacific or the Atlantic, if you're in the ocean, yeah, you'll definitely be thrown up and down, but it's a nice long wave. You're not getting splashed by that perfect storm wave, right? Like in the movie. But if you hit a rogue wave, you're obviously going to get a big duck diving surf maneuver with your entire ship, cargo and all. Now, one of the things that's super mystifying to me about any of these theories, and we're going to get through some more here, is that big ships disappear with hundreds of these containers on the ship. This is what happens in the modern day time, right? So these ships, you would think even if the ship went down, those containers are just on top. The containers fall off ships all the time in the Pacific and end up finding them floating around somewhere. Now, can a container sink? Oh yeah, sure. I don't think that a lot of them are completely sealed, you know. I'm not into that business, but I'm assuming they have a little leak here, a little leak there, so eventually it'll take on enough water and sink. It's obviously carrying something. But it seems kind of bizarre that a ship will disappear and they will put out a huge group of people searching for the wreckage, and they can't find anything. And I know the ocean's a really big place, and even if someone told you, we searched 1 million square miles, it doesn't mean anything. But now, one of the things that they don't really have figured out in terms of, and I shouldn't say they don't have it figured out because how could I know? But I didn't see anyone make this correlation blatantly. They will say these two facts between boat and plane, but no one stops the documentary and goes, whoa, that's a commonality between these two. Which is that the instruments, especially compasses, seem to have an anomaly where they completely freak out. And, you know, sometimes what they'll say is that they'll say to amateur boat people with smaller boats, oh, that's just because you have shorting equipment. You got some water splash in your system. And some of these guys have been fishing out there for 20, 30 years. They're like, I've never had a short in my equipment, because when you have a short in your equipment, you typically have to go get it fixed. You blow a fuse or something like that. And some of these guys have never had that happen. So I don't think I've ever had a short. But the interesting thing about this flying compass is that it hits planes and it hits the boats, which means whatever is happening happens at sea level, literally, and it happens at whatever altitude these planes are flying. Now, the other thing is that the planes that seem to be having the issues are always small planes, or older planes like back in the 40s that didn't have super high altitudes. And there's just some tragic stories of these people perishing out there. I mean, think about it. Let's just say the 3,002 or 3,150 number is right. My God, that's 3,150 vehicles disappearing, and multiplied times the people who disappeared in these events. You have more than 9/11 right there. It's a pretty big loss, you know. But what would control an electromagnetic mechanism from functioning properly? Now, there was a distinction in that when planes get into this other thing, which is spatial disorientation, which we're going to talk about, modern planes have a lot of modern equipment that do not rely on more ancient equipment that is electromagnetic compasses in the dashboard of the plane. So there are other ways of figuring out your orientation in a plane if you know how to fly by instruments in modern day times. What I didn't hear in any of the documentaries that said that 5 vehicles disappear a year is that I'm not hearing that report on an aeronautical level. Like 1 plane disappears a year. without, again, any SOS, no found wreckage of any kind. But now if you're a buff of Bermuda and you're familiar with Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Steven Spielberg, you'll be well aware that the opening scene where the French translator runs out to the desert with the scientist he works for, they discover some planes from Flight 19 in the desert. I forget what desert it is. I apologize. And there's a boat out there, and I don't know if the boat was ever likened to the Bermuda, but it seems like that was sort of the gist of it. But before we get into Flight 19, which happens in early December 5th, it's important to remember that the same year, on July 10th, that it was a Navy patrol plane, I guess piloted by Thomas Arthur Garner, takes off with a 10-man crew and is never heard from again. Last time they reported their position was 1:16 a.m. Now, when I was listening to the fishermen of Bermuda, and again, it's not always in the tip of the triangle. In fact, a lot of these flights and a lot of these boats that have issues that are reported in the Bermuda Triangle, if you really take a look at their path on that particular day, every time air traffic control saw someone, every time the radar got a ping back from a ship, they only passed through the Bermuda Triangle before they had other problems outside of the Bermuda Triangle. And anytime that happens, they always blame it on the triangle. So be careful with your research. That might be why there's a discrepancy between 3,000 ships and 2,000 ships. Maybe somebody filtered out 1,000 ships that only passed through it, but didn't perish in it. I don't know. But the fishermen made a very interesting statement that it was just, again, glossed over. It's weird. They said a lot of the problems we run into is in the summertime. And the summertime creates, for various reasons that are obvious, mist and clouds and hurricanes and crazy storms that come out of nowhere. They said it was very, very common when you're fishing just off the coast of Bermuda, and I don't mean that far away. Because again, right off the bat, you have a 4,000-foot drop, which is nearly a mile. I mean, that's just insane, right? If you want to know how deep 4,000 miles or 4,000 feet is, if you think back to that time, the Russians had that submarine that sank. I can't remember. It was like Nova Scotia area or something. I'm probably wrong, but it's sort of like that little mezzanine between America and Europe, I think. And we were offering to go and help them. I believe that was just about 360 feet. And it was so volatile, no one could just escape. You get the bends and you die. You'd be crushed, most likely. So 4,000 is huge. This one seaplane has a problem during the summer. But Flight 19 was December 5th. And there's going to be another December 5th flight that happens, I believe, in 1970 that we're going to talk about that had a potential time warp experience as confirmed by their departure time and their arrival time. They were supposed to have an hour and 20-minute flight if everything went well with great weather, and sometimes it goes up to about an hour and a half, but they were able to get from the Bahamas to Florida in about 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And so we'll get back to that one as well. But Flight 19 is a training exercise. A flight instructor by the name of Taylor is guiding some students to fly to this sort of area between Puerto Rico and Bermuda. And then they were supposed to turn and then fly over to Bermuda. And then they dropped some fake bombs into the ocean. And then they are supposed to fly back to Florida. Well, there's been more analysis on Flight 19 than I think any other disappearance in the history of the Bermuda Triangle. And again, at this time, because the phrase was coined in 1964, and again, I saw some documentary that said it was coined in the 1950s, but then they didn't cite any sources. So we're going to go with that magazine, which literally wrote a fictional piece about the area and embellished a bunch of things, but it was a fictional magazine. It just stuck. That was all. What a great Bermuda Triangle. What a great idea. So this guy goes off with his students. They make their first waypoint. They turn and go to Bermuda. They do drop their bombs. And now it's time to come home. And for whatever reason, the leader gets lost. And he believes that he has been flying. This is what's really strange, because this instructor had been there several times and had done this several times with his students. And there's all kinds of pilots that have done these flights. Now, this is right after World War II ended, so they're still practicing and, and just kind of keeping sharp. But by the time he reports back to air traffic control, he thinks he's all of a sudden by the Keys, which, if you don't know this area geographically, you know that there's Florida that comes down into the ocean. And the Keys are on the lower right-hand side, or lower left-hand side of the island. So that's quite a distance from where he last was. So for him to make that miscalculation is kind of strange. He would have had to have been flying for hours to get there. What they think happened was that he mistaken some islands off the coast of Bermuda by flying in potentially a circle of some sort as the Keys. And so he thought, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to go north or even east into Florida, and we'll find the airport somewhere and we'll land. And of course, that would be, if he's in Bermuda, that would explain why their radio transmissions kept getting weaker and weaker, and they're running low on fuel. And there's a lot of speculation of like, why would his students follow him? And I would say that if the conditions were so bad that an instructor who had been there several times is getting lost, then his students have really no chance in hell beating the system of potentially spatial disorientation. Now, the spatial disorientation is more fascinating than just the Bermuda Triangle. And they call it vertigo, but it's not really the vertigo that you and I might experience in the modern day times, where cell phone towers are probably jingling your brain a little bit and then you suddenly have vertigo. Like, once 4G hit Southern California, I had 3 friends of mine suddenly have massive vertigo. One was a chef, one was a designer, and one was my neighbor across the street. And then they reported their relatives kind of catching it. It's really weird. But spatial disorientation is the theory that when you're on land, walking with your legs especially, you have all kinds of landmarks around you that let you know where you are, whether you're up or down. Now, for any of you that have gone to an amusement park where you go through a tunnel that's rotating, you'll know what spatial disorientation feels like. Your brain is trying to grasp something that isn't moving to give you some orientation. For those of you who get car sickness, very similar problem. What do you do when you get in a car and you get car sickness? If you're sitting in the front seat, you don't usually get it when you're driving because you're staring at the road. Landmark, 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 that you're this way and not the other way. You need to stop reading your book. You need to stop looking at your phone and start staring out the front window at the highway. And if you have driving sickness, then you shouldn't be in a backseat ever, because it'd be much rather someone give up shotgun and you not puke everywhere. But if you are in the back seat, you want to sit right in the middle of the back seat and just utterly, you grab the 2 chairs in front of you and you stare out the front. Chairs giving you some stability on your stomach, and then stare straight ahead. Don't let anyone take your eyes off that. At night, it can be a little more difficult. But now imagine you're in a plane built in the 40s. You don't have a lot of modern equipment. Now, there's going to be another anomaly with the compass that's going to make it even worse. So you're like, hey, man, I've flown in bad storms before or whatever. Again, these planes don't go tremendously high in the air. So typically landmarks are not hard to find. But when you have a mist below you and potentially a storm on top of you, not a tremendous storm, doesn't have to be a hurricane or anything, you're staring out the window. I just saw a video someone posted, I don't know if it was a Daily Dose of Internet or whatever, but this is what you see when you fly in a snowstorm. And oh my God, it looks like the Millennium Falcon going to light speed, you are completely and utterly disoriented. You could be upside down and you wouldn't know it. So what happens is the mind starts to let go of all of its spatial acuity, and you start to, in some cases, depending on your constitution, and it doesn't matter how many flying hours you have, it doesn't. If you've never experienced it before, the perfect storm, as they might say, you can panic hardcore. And there's going to be a story I'm going to tell you about these two non-elite twins, the Rothschild twins, who were coming to visit their father. I guess they were going to be going to a funeral, I think. And their pilot freaked completely out, but we'll get back to that story in a little bit. So Flight 19 just keeps getting quieter and quieter on the radio. Several dudes are in this squad, 13 to be exact, with 14 airmen. So to make matters worse, right after this thing goes down, it's 14 people in these planes and 5 Avenger aircraft, TBF aircraft, and then another plane goes out to try to find them, and it had 13 people on it, and it disappears completely. And someone said they saw an explosion in the sky. And apparently the plane that went out there definitely had maintenance issues, and it was sort of an emergency thing. The Avengers were not like the movie. They were planes that were on constant call because of World War II. And so they're just always sitting there ready. So that's what that squad was all about. So they then conduct a gigantic search. I think it was over 242 planes searched the entire area and north and just everywhere they last heard these signals and could triangulate their location. And they found nothing, which just, I don't know. I mean, maybe Avenger planes do just sink to the bottom of the ocean pretty quickly. Again, it's a big ocean and you're looking down, it's reflective and it's got white caps sometimes. And so even if you saw something, you may not know what you're seeing or whatever. They didn't find anybody. Now, there was a rumor circulated about 1998-ish that the Taylor guy managed to get rescued, that he did crash, he managed to get rescued, and then he married some island girls on one of the islands somewhere, and that he was so worried about getting court-martialed because all of his other students died that he just kind of kept quiet. But that was never proven. In fact, the gentlemen that were of his age in the Air Force, because every December 5th, there's a ceremony in Florida for Flight 19, at least there was up until 2000. They're always scouting the place for someone of that age who looks like Taylor, who might just visit the memorial. If the guy was smart, he would never do such a thing. So Flight 19 feels pretty mysterious, except we know that he ran into a compass issue. His instruments were all crazy. He was calling to his other students saying, are any of your compasses working? So they could figure out where the hell they were. And they were all having issues. Now let's just say the theory about how the Earth's interior, made of electricity, plasma electricity, and you see this all the time with volcanoes that erupt, burp, lightning bolts. It's probably one of the only times you'll see lightning bolts come out of the ground. When lightning bolts come down from storms, they always ground themselves to the earth because it's where the core is, right? Now, for any of you who study pre-dynastic, pre-Inca construction from my other episodes, you'll know that there's a rock species in South America that when you go up to it and it's in the mountain, you could put a compass on it and nothing happens. But if you cut it out and turn it into an H, it all of a sudden makes the compass fly. It's very strange. Might be how they might have built highways out of these H rocks and then just push rocks on top of them to get them from one place to another. And then you could cannibalize your road from the back and put it to the front, so you wouldn't have to have an infinite amount. These rocks aren't completely light, but they're definitely light enough and small enough that man could move them. So you have this real volatile area in the Earth's crust. Hence the methane bursts that come out of the bottom of the earth. Well, imagine during these bursts, or even without the methane coming out, the crust lets go of some torrent of electricity, invisible to the human eye, but up to the bottom of the earth, and therefore you get some anomaly in anything that's going to rely on a magnetic pole. As well, think about all the hurricanes that happen in that area and how they seem to gain energy in that area. Well, ether moves just like water. Now, water's a different thing in terms of its mass and how it displaces things. So when I say that ethereal pressures are gravity, it's not the same thing exactly as the way air and water work with pressure in that realm. Imagine the whole thing can't be discovered because they can't allow out the theory of ether. But that would account for compasses going nuts in boats and compasses going nuts in planes. It could also account for the fact that even though you do have a very warm sector of the world there, you do get these warm and cold fronts pounding into each other, but they do seem to augment and boost in this area. So I think that just as a layman meteorologist, you could say, I mean, we've all said it to ourselves. We're looking at a hurricane prediction, we're looking at the aerial photographs of it, and then you're just going, geez, what must it be like to be in the ocean right there? Well, that's a gigantic hurricane that's as big as a state. But what about a bunch of little ones that just need to clobber a boat or disorient a pilot or even knock a pilot out of the sky? Because back in the day, these planes didn't go high enough to fly over a lot of these clouds. So in comes the Bruce Gernon experience. I don't know how to spell his last name. 1970, December 4th. The day before, Flight 19 had an issue way back in 1945. How interestingly coincidental. Now, I'm going to pre-qualify this by saying the following. I just recently watched his testimony. This is a father-son. I don't know if the father was still alive when this was taken. I think the father's definitely got to be passed at this point. Now, the son that recalled the story, he kind of changed the story a little bit from the first version of it that I heard. And he was blinking like one of these guys who does UFO testimonies where it kind of falls apart. So I don't know. It just seems strange, but it did seem like he was citing his flight log, both the Bahama departure time with flight control and the Miami flight control when he arrives. But he takes off with his dad and starts flying towards Miami. It's going to be a 90-minute flight on average. And it was a good day. It was a good day. He says, suddenly, though, in the middle of this wonderful weather, which is not uncommon for this area, a giant lenticulous cloud came up, and he said it was probably capped out about 60,000 feet. So he couldn't fly around it easily. If he did, he'd be flying for a long time. And, of course, there's fuel issues and all that kind of stuff. And this guy had, quite a bit of experience flying some of these two destinations because he's a property developer. He said that the cloud started to change shape right in front of him and started to sink in the middle, creating kind of a U shape and it's right where they're flying, which he thought was really weird. He said as they flew into this horseshoe, sort of like what Moses parted in the sea, except the base is still up in the sky, said that the cloud then encircled them and started creating a tunnel. He said that the light flickering inside the clouds was extremely rapid and strange because he'd flown several times past storms and through storms, and he said usually it's more, pow there, wait a little while, boom, boom, boom. But he said this one was just like strobing. He said then a tunnel started to form inside this little pocket that was going counterclockwise. The first version of the story was that these guys were stuck in there for a really long time, and no matter what they did, they couldn't get out of it. The version I heard him tell the story with his own words being filmed, where he's blinking like crazy, it wasn't as dramatized. So that's good. Don't know where the other story came from. But he's trying to punch through this hole. at the end because he can still see sky on the other side of this hole. And so they're trying to punch through it. And what we don't know is how many minutes into the flight he had already taken place when he hits this U-shaped thing that surrounds his plane. But by the time he punches out of this thing, he said that immediately the radio goes nuts from air traffic control going, oh my God, I got a plane in my zone. And they said that air traffic control told him that we couldn't see you. Once you entered this cloud, we could not see you anymore on radar. Now, I don't think that's a giant stretch because everything's electrical in radar. And so it could be the cloud was just providing so much electrical activity that, it just bounces off the cloud or goes in and gets all messed up like a stealth aircraft or something. But he says that the flight time, again, between the Bahamas and Miami was about 45 minutes. So for him, he believes he got into some sort of time warp. All right. There isn't, outside of like mathematical theories on paper, there's not really any substantive example of time warps occurring that would account for such a thing. Like we can't say, oh, well, it happened over there, and then there's this thing over here. Now, I did read a funny story about a plane that departed from the New York area, and it was supposed to be flying to one of the Caribbean islands of I can't remember which one it was. And it takes off and it disappears, and they never found it. And then supposedly in the 1990, the ship it disappeared somewhere in the 60s or something, and then there was a tall tale that an air traffic control guy with a name that nobody recognizes as an employee suddenly sees the plane, and it lands. And when they start trying to reconcile, who are you, where are you from, and somebody was trying to figure out the date, and then they told him before they exited the plane, opened the plane up, that it was 1990. The dude freaks out, the pilot, and then re-throttles up and takes off as all the emergency vehicles are rushing to the plane. Apparently, there was a fictional article written somewhere in the early 80s that was exactly that story, and it got resurrected and retold. And everybody in local areas like, hey man, we would love for that to be true, but no one knows about this happening. So all those emergency vehicle people were like, what are you talking about? We never did this. It's a Twilight Zone episode. It's a couple Twilight Zone episodes mixed together, to be honest. Now, if we were to really stretch things, okay, which may or may not be a stretch, but there's a couple ways we could maybe incubate up some sort of time anomaly. The more difficult one to wrap your mind around would be if the Earth is ejecting a tremendous amount of electrical energy, then anomalies can occur in electricity that we haven't observed anywhere else, at least above ground, that anyone's willing to admit, which might account for this cloud. There's the joke where you see big sort of mothership clouds. Maybe those are lenticulus. I have to figure it out. And you just drive by them in the desert sometimes. Oh, there's the UFO. So it could be that just a natural phenomenon occurs where somehow there's a little mini Einstein-Rosen bridge, a little jump, which is all Rosen stuff probably. It's interesting. I think what's actually easier to believe if you're a ufologist, is that right? Is that what if these vehicles are coming in and out of Earth's, realm of existence, and they are using technology that warps space-time. And so you're merely getting close to them, and you're jumping on the back of their technology. I mean, imagine this big cloud has a ship in it. It's big, but it's not as big as the cloud, because that's why they encapsulate themselves in it. And you simply drift on top of their gravity wave or whatever it is, and you're able to do a little hopscotch technique. Because they didn't see you, you don't have to do anything about it. For the vehicles that may have disappeared due to UFOs, it could be one of two things, because so many vehicles are never found. For instance, the Bahamas has a very shallow, I think a 50-foot average maximum depth around the islands, and tons of boats and tons of planes have disappeared. Not just boats. Boats kind of make me think about kidnappers and human traffickers. But a bunch of stuff's disappeared in the Bahamas as well, and no one's found anything ever. And so it's not that deep not to find some wreckage of some sort. But now imagine that you are not probably Flight 19 that seems to have meticulously dramatized through real life getting lost in the ocean. There wasn't like, they went out 5 minutes and they disappeared. It was clear as day, if you had a situation where, like, I look out on my left window and I saw Flight 19, and then I look straight ahead, then I look left and he's gone, and it's broad daylight and there's no storm, well, then you got like a wild-ass story. But if this were some proxy zone where they're coming in and out of the ocean, if you believe that, right? Then you have potentially, they saw us, they better come with us situation, which is where you might have the situations where boats are found, but the crew is gone. Now, the other big one is that pirates do exist in the modern day times, and they will hop on ships and force people on radios to make normal communications, even though they're kidnapped because they got a gun to their head and they want to live. And they're like, I don't give a crap about anything on this boat. And so that stuff happens too. There was a famous boat that kept showing up and showing up and showing up, and it would show up without anyone on it. And people would pass the boat, and I forgot the name of it, but they'd look over and like, what the hell's that boat? I don't see anyone on the deck. They'd radio over to it, and no one would say anything. And it didn't seem to have any cargo on it. And then sometimes later on they'd find it with a crew on it, but it looked like a little renegade crew. And then when someone said they were going to go get the boat, all of a sudden the boat vanishes, and I think one of them ended up off the coast of Ireland or something, and it was empty, derelict, completely, ready to be torn down. So that happens as well, so keep that in the back of your mind. But now there's another anomaly where you will hear, and I remember this when I was a kid, the city underneath the center of the Bermuda area, slightly closer to Florida. And here's the thing. I've told you guys a long time ago about the dude who did it must have been a 3-hour special on Flat Earth, and him proving that he had tracked new plates in the Pacific coming out of the crack down the Pacific. And he says there's one in the Atlantic, but the Atlantic crust is slightly stronger. Pacific is weaker. So the Pacific Ocean floor grew way faster, which is why it goes down from the continents, right? Continents were on top, all pushed together, no Pangea drift. Everything connects all the way around. And as the Earth rips apart, it starts sinking and sinking because it's all brand new. And there's no mass anymore to fill it up. And one of the big key signs that this was definitely the case was that in his theory, he said that and again, get out Google Earth. If you've never seen this before, it will change your whole perspective on everything, especially you flat earthers. Take a look at it, because you got to account for this. He said that he was pretty conclusive that the way that the Earth ripped apart, there was a quarantined barrier at the Indonesian islands when they were all connected together, that the Pacific Ocean was a mile lower, up to a mile lower than the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if this dude's wrong, it might have been even higher. Who knows? But right around the Indonesian islands, if you look on the bottom of the ocean, you see the huge sludge mark where he believes that it gave way and then rushed down to the bottom of the ocean. I mean, it's undeniable if you just look at it, in my opinion. Remember, deep thoughts can't observe reality and just say, yeah, it's right there. Then we're screwed. We can't let previous commitments to other paradigms impact our ability to get to the truth. Easter Island. Easter Island was discovered by the Dutch in the early 1700s, and all those little heads were all everywhere. Little, I mean, size of a house, right? But when they look for the stone that those heads are made out of, it's not indigenous to the actual island itself. The closest distance today, if you stay above the ocean surface, is 12,000 miles away in Asia. But if you drain the ocean down several hundred feet, it's right off the coast. For any of you who follow Graham Hancock and you study he and his wife doing dives off the coast of Japan, where they found like temples and all kinds of stuff, where they keep trying to tell you it's a natural formation. Pacific was lower. People used to live down there. They rushed up into the hills once this catastrophe occurs. Could be the reason why they have a myth, or a story, I should say, about a great flood. I grew up in Kansas. Lots of seashells in Kansas. But no like big giant shark carcasses or anything like that. And so we think that those guys very logically suggested that when you have a mile of water with, I don't even know how many trillions of tons of water coming towards the coasts of everything in the Americas, you will get the Malibu Hills out of this crashing wave that could be, by the time it hits the coast, half a mile high. I mean, just imagine viewing that. Yeah. And so it splashes water all the way into the Americas. And then I get, in Kansas, several million years later, a bunch of seashells in my backyard. That makes no sense. The other one is that there was a piece of research that I read about a bunch of German scientists who did reverse engineering on the age of the ocean by reversing the salt content in the ocean, knowing how much it exponentially grows, and then reversing that algorithm. And the conclusion of their article was that they said the oceans can't be any more than 60 million years old. You roll it back and everything's gone. Okay, well, that is definitely a huge distance back for mankind, but I just looked up a website today which had a picture of a hammer that had been encapsulated in stone. And when they carbon date the stone, and I know there's a big question about that technology's accuracy, but this was encased in stone. It was a wooden handle that goes up through a stone beveled hammer top, and it was dated approximately 140 million years ago. So again, those who control the world want you to believe that we just got here, especially because of the sort of the Jesuit Christian pressure of saying the Old Testament is the beginning of time. Adam and Eve was just 4,500, years ago. Nothing can be older than that. The other one is the big Ice Age argument, which again, I'm not a huge fan of this sort of. It's sort of like the laziest anthropological conclusion to any story. You'll be like studying something really brilliant, and they go, well, then, of course, the Ice Age happened. Like, of course, you weren't there, and you're full of crap that icebergs got down to Egypt. The only way icebergs get down to Egypt is to rotate the poles of the Earth, which very well may have happened because of maps transposed in 1392 that have the Antarctica island, continent or whatever, completely mapped out without any snow on it. Interesting. Could be a psyop, who knows? Now, the other story about the guy and his father flying through that lenticulous cloud was that one of his versions of the story was he said that the plane seemed like it was flying itself. That's fascinating, but he didn't say that in the interview that I saw where it was actually him talking. If you're a ufologist with the Bermuda Triangle, what's interesting about it is, wouldn't that be the way to get these people out of your hair? You're in a UFO, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, let's make sure they get the hell away from us. It'll be an amazing little story for them. They're going to lose some time, or at least transpose space and time. Interesting. Now, for the Rothschild brothers, this supposedly, and I didn't get the year down, unfortunately, they said it happened before Flight 19, but it's these two identical twin brothers that were, again, I think they were in the Navy, and they were just taking a plane from point A to point B to go to this funeral. And they said that the pilot just utterly panics. He gets absolute spatial disorientation. he was yelling at them in the back seat going, I want you guys to both look out, starboard and port windows and let me know if you see anything on the ground, anything, because I don't know where the hell we are. Eventually, he stated that he was too terrified to fly the plane, and the co-pilot had to take over and fly the plane, and they managed to land safely. And apparently one of the brothers didn't fly for 20 years. He was so freaked out about flying. And I'd have to say that would definitely get me on the edge too. But now the brothers also reported the instrument problem. So I think that we can conclusively say that something is most likely emitting from the Earth at this particular region and spiraling up into the sky, confusing all instruments on boats and all instruments in the sky. Now, one of the other potential ways that they think that some of these things happen is that there's some wild, round, like sinkholes all up and down the area between Bermuda and the Bahamas. In fact, only a handful of them have ever been investigated. If you see them on a map, it's wild. You'll have like that crystal clear blue water, and then all of a sudden, poof, it's just a bottomless pit, like really freaky. And so they said that they said certain holes, and depending on the velocity of the ship and the currents and all that kind of stuff, you could actually be buoyant with a certain surface underneath you. And then as you hit one of these holes, your front end could tip down inside the hole, especially if you got one of these rogue waves on you, and then poof, you're going to be underwater before you know it. Now, what would seem logical is that they could at least lower instruments down into these holes and find out if anything's down there, or put one of those deep sea submarines down there and see if something's down there. Now, it was stated very clearly by specialists who do search for treasure and ships that everywhere in the bottom of the ocean, everywhere, there are shipwrecks all over the place. There just are. Not as many planes. So that might be a sign of something, or it could be that the planes simply disintegrate so much that by the time they get to the bottom and get coral all over them and sedimentary rock all over them, you just don't find them as easily as a ship that's going to be a much bigger object. And again, I didn't read anything about commercial air flights having a huge issue down in that area. But what came clearly out of the indigenous fishermen of the area was they said that, a lot of people go down there to either retire and take up fishing, or they're just some kind of nomadic kid who's going to do a few years down there and go back to wherever they live. They said that one of the biggest reasons why tourists, like there's boats where a honeymooning couple rents a boat to go out and they just disappear and they're never found again, was they said that just without any major reasons, without water funnels or water spouts or major storms like hurricanes with names and things, they said that once you get over a deeper ocean, they said actually there's two things. Once you get over the deeper ocean, you get into much more violent waters. They said that even, like one of the fishermen was saying that, look, it might not sound intense because when you start fishing, you start going out towards the especially in Bermuda Island where you've got this 4,000 foot drop, they'll go right out to the edge and kind of stop the boat. And then they fish over that edge because they said you'll start off and you'll have like 2 or 3 foot waves if it's kind of rough, which if you've ever been on a boat, a 2 or 3 foot wake off someone else's boat, even at a lake, can make you sick and make you disoriented, and definitely makes the ride really rough depending how fast you're going. I remember I've been at Havasu in monsoons, and it can get incredibly violent with just a rainstorm. It's nuts. But they said these 2 and 3 foot waves will suddenly turn into 6 and 8 foot waves. And he goes, if you don't have a big ship, you can go under really, really fast. Because again, the boat will rear up, tipping the front end. And then when you duck dive into the face of a wave, you can just keep going down. And one of my old bosses was a big deep sea diver. And I asked him one time, I said, there's this terminal depth that your body goes down into the ocean, or in water in general, where if you go past this amount of feet in the ocean, the amount of weight over your head is so heavy that you'll start going faster and faster towards the bottom of the ocean. That's just like scary as hell, right? Okay. So he said, I asked him once, and he goes, it's about 35 to 40 feet. You start getting so much weight over your head, you got a problem. So you never know. You got a big rogue wave on you, and then within seconds you're 100 feet in the under the ocean, and you're attached to a boat. And maybe you get a chance to swim up, but if you swim up and it's a big storm up there, and you're way away from the coast, and you can't see any land, and you don't have your compass on you, if it even worked, you're pretty much screwed. I mean, it's just these tragedies at sea are something else. You know, the ocean's a very formidable thing, and I think that once you see a few tsunami videos, you start to understand the utter power of water. And what's crazy is when you see those tsunami videos from Fukushima/Japan, you start to realize that this water doesn't have to make even a peep for it to take out cities within minutes. Cities that have been there thousands of years, you know. Now, in terms of, let's go back to UFOs to finish this thing off. The big question I have about the UFO situation with these sort of deep sea base concepts, especially Bill Cooper's story, is the choice of a UFO to fatally injure a human being. It would seem as if we just take all the sightings we've ever heard about and all the stories we've ever heard about, the only time that I've ever heard a consistency about vehicles that are unidentified in the sky harming human beings would be what I would probably chalk up to military vehicles that are using very proprietary, strange, experimental fuel systems, like in the triangle sightings, the Aurora Project sort of stuff, where people look up at the vehicle and they get burned with radiation. They typically, some of them even died of radiation poisoning. But the straight up, saucer UFOs or cigar-shaped UFOs, or the ones that the pilots are chasing, I've never heard of those hurting any human beings. Bill Cooper says he sees 2 leave and 2 enter right next to his ship. So if they're terribly concerned about us seeing them, then I think we would have much more information about hostile interactions with these vehicles. Now, the interesting thing about being on the bottom of the ocean as a observer of Earth, whether they contributed to its creation or its population or whatever, it doesn't have to have any of those things to be amazingly mysterious to observe, right? As a scientist from another world, is that if they were closer to a really volatile area of the Earth's crust, then because of its plasma core, they could extrapolate from the core infinite power to do whatever they want. Maybe not that they need it, but, you put a power source inside your vehicle, and then that makes the vehicle run. But when you're on the bottom of the ocean, wouldn't it be nice to have a power source that's part of the planet you go to? We would do it. What if we show up to, like, the planet Io and we just have geothermal everywhere and there's volcanoes everywhere, and so we just tap in and then we have infinite power to do any research that we want, including force fields to protect us from the elements. It would support manufacturing. It would support scientific equipment. And one thing that I don't think has ever been theorized, we'll just throw it out there, is that there's this talk since I was a little kid about how the electromagnetic poles inside the bowels of the Earth shift, wobble. And this has been proven, I believe. And if the old maps are of any indication of the Earth's history, then it could be that these things do shift at some point. And again, we're on a 23-degree tilt from what should probably be a straight up and down rotation, depending on how the solar system did its thing. There are summer solstice and winter solstice structures in South America that are 23 degrees off which I think is phenomenal. And that's by that Brian Forrester guy. And he was right there when he showed it to you on the video. You'll have to get in that guy's channel to see that. So it seemed like the world did shift at one point. And that's probably the most terrifying natural catastrophe that could occur for man. To have where I'm sitting right now, which is more, for at least America, only Florida is warmer than us, where we are. And so imagine it shifting and the polar ice caps are suddenly where I'm sitting, and now I got to move to, who knows, the Antarctica to get warm. So I'm not personally convinced that UFOs would harm man, but if, and I would say that I wouldn't imagine them to be building any sort of structure that would randomly affect such a wide area where everyone's having these instrument problems. The instrument problem thing is utterly fascinating, and what's fascinating about it to me is that, one, obviously more ships and more aircraft fly over that than wreck, obviously. But there is some weird condition where maybe due to electrical storms, which seems a little odd because we fly vehicles directly into hurricanes to find out how powerful they are. And we don't use, mechanical devices that rely on what they call it, magnetic poles 100%. We've got other equipment, satellites, and other communication with like an AWACS plane to make sure that it always knows where it is. But you would think the military would be the first people to lock it down. To go, okay, we're in the Navy. We can't be surprised at any point in time. We're the Air Force. We can't be surprised when doing maneuvers. Regardless, if we have equipment that can override these natural phenomena, we need to know, because what if something else is affecting things? What if you got EMP'd flying in the air and your Raptor just falls out of the sky? You don't want anything like that, or a bomber or something, Now, luckily, bombers fly really, really high. 60,000 feet, man, that's up there. That's the old U-2 altitude, right? I don't think a bomber typically maintains that type of altitude. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. There's all these theoretical planes they're talking about. I think it was the B-1 that actually talked about using an ionized wave to keep going in the atmosphere at high altitudes. So there's some interesting technology out there. As far as the old ships going down, for me, a lot of that seems like very frail ships for the time going into one of the most volatile weather regions this world has. I'm not aware of, other than maybe off the coast of Mexico, south of me, any real constant hurricane region. I have an app on my phone that not only tells me the weather, but it has a hurricane, indicator, and you'll see those little spiral icons, and it shows you where a projected path goes. And I've been looking at that thing for 10 years, and really, it's just right in that region that is 95% of all the hurricanes that exist. And what I don't understand, if the documentary I saw was correct about the Navy/military not having Bahamas and Bermuda and that area, Puerto Rico, all the way over to America, not being listed as one of the biggest threats for vehicles, I find that kind of hard to believe simply because of all the hurricanes. But I'm not familiar with how they categorize that stuff, so it might just be that they say, okay, we're not talking about hurricanes. When there is a hurricane, we take precautions and we don't fly in those regions. But what we're really talking about is when there's not a hurricane and there's an anomaly that's taking ships out of the sky and sucking them down to the bottom of the ocean if they're boats. This region of the world and all those stories, I think it fascinates the hell out of us because it's sort of a frontier of the unknown. If we start to accept the unexplained, I think we owe it to ourselves for the professionals that can study these kind of things, because they're in the region and they have the equipment and they have the scientific background. It's definitely something that needs to be continually researched until we can put a boat. I mean, what if they just took a boat and they remote controlled it and they had tons of video equipment on it and extra GPS reporting mechanisms that perhaps report to satellites or whatever. And just one every month or a week or whatever, you just send this fairly good-sized boat from one point to the other. Let everybody else know, here comes this boat. It's all red or something, or orange, so you know it's one of those drone boats. And see if you can't make it happen. Even go out to regions where you know boats had problems at a particular time of year. You know, December 5th is a pretty scary little time to be a plane flying in that area. But one of the, the number one cause recorded in the official journals of most of these accidents is human error. And as one of the documentary filmmakers said, he goes, I know that's a bit of a letdown to hear that this is all just human beings having problems with spatial disorientation. And, you know, okay, so let's say you have 3,000 boats, 150 planes, and human error accounts for, let's say, 90%. That leaves a lot left. That's 300 boats and 15 planes that are going to be left in the equation that don't have any explanation. Flight 19 would disappear, probably due to human error. As romantic as it might have been. And again, if you haven't seen Close Encounters as a movie in general, you're in for a good ride there. It's pretty timeless, to be honest. There's some bell bottoms in it, but other than that, it's just so well made. So well made. I think mysteries in general are so elusive, which is why when I write a film, I try to put a mystery in there. Because it just has a natural Pavlovian reaction to mysteries or fear. And mysteries are also inquisitive. Isn't it interesting how probably every one of you have heard about some cataclysmic mystery where you're talking about, you know, at some point, this volcano does a certain thing, or this, you know, Bermuda Triangle does a certain thing, or whatever it might be. It's something formidable that can kill you. And it could even be like a UFO who's angry at you or something. And you might say to yourself, well, gosh, I would sacrifice my life to die, but also just before I die, seconds before I die, I get to see the mystery unraveled. You know, now for me personally, the Bermuda thing, unless I'm going to get scooped up by a UFO very safely, I would not want to experience anything I've heard on these documentaries. But, you know, the whole thing of I've said in episodes a long time ago, my mini UFO episodes, if a UFO landed and said, look, would you like to come with us? Now, you don't know if they know that you need to eat 3 times a day, and you need to take a leak, you need to take a dump, you got to sleep, you can't be in 0 Kelvin environments, you can't be in, you know, volcanic environments or really hot. You don't know if they know anything about what you need to get you from point A to point B. And even if they say, oh yeah, totally, we got you all taken care of. Well, there's 2 different ways to run that scenario. You say no and find out if they grab you, or you say yes and you get in there and suddenly you find out as the ship takes off, you're an ice cube in 2 seconds, or you're atomized for some reason. What I think is healthy about these conversations is, one, to definitely get to a point where maybe you dismiss some of the mythos that's around our world, because it tends to make you susceptible to other forms of belief that are potentially dangerous to your person. You know, it's one thing to say that you believe in a spiritual deity, some sort of God of some sort, and then it's all fun and games until you start hearing voices that say, kill this person, do this, do that, and then you're like, oh gosh, I got to do this because I believe this is my creator saying this. And so it gets a little strange. As well, it's sort of the razor's edge, because on one side of the razor, you're talking about perhaps being indoctrinated into mythos that aren't based on any reality, and then you become susceptible and gullible to other things. And the other side of the razor, you have a super open mind that doesn't pride yourself on skepticism, right? Skepticism is a faux way to feel intelligent. I'll just warn you. You can be brilliant skeptics, right? The gentleman that was in charge of the Skeptic Society for a long time, an amazing man. He was a magician in his previous life. And so when he joined the Skeptic Society and eventually ran it, he went to South America and he was killing a lot of placebo techniques for healing, which had a history of working for people because placebo is a massive method of convincing your body to heal itself. And so by going down and saying, this is a fraud, you guys shouldn't give this guy any of your money, you could be killing more people than you save. And sure, someone might have an illness that is not curable by these techniques. I don't think there's anything you can't cure your body from. I just honestly believe that. If you get the book Holographic Universe, there's a section about 40% into the book where a gentleman had cancer in his pelvis. He had lost the top half of his femur bone, big part of his pelvis, but he was from South America. He believed in healing pools. And supposedly he spent about 1.5 years visiting this healing pool, and they have the before and after x-ray of his body. And they have him with no femur bone. I mean, you realize there's a ball and joint in that little area, cartilage plates and all kinds of stuff, right? And this kid grew it all back, and he was fine. There's the old story about the doctor who had a patient with lymph node cancer. And a pharmaceutical company had come up with a shot that they said would cure lymph node cancer. And so the gentleman had this, was about to go into chemo, and then he learned about this pharmaceutical company, went to his doctor and said, I need you to get me that shot. I don't want to start chemo until I take this shot and see if it works. So he gets the shot and immediately starts going into a full regression of his cancer. But the problem is that the pharmaceutical company, who probably had a cure for cancer, to be honest, was then kicked out of the FDA approval, had to have had it and then didn't have it. And he panicked that the shot didn't do anything. And so his lymph node cancer started coming back. So his doctor knew that he had cured himself, or the shot was working, one of the two. The problem was he couldn't get any more of the medication because it was forbidden. So what the doctor did was he got a big placebo shot, and he brings a patient back in and says, okay, here's the deal. It's all a conspiracy. The shot does work. The oncology departments of the world who make trillions of dollars off of you every decade has demonized them. It does work. And I managed to get another shot, and this one's super powerful. And then he gives the patient the shot. Full regression of his cancer, lymph nodes all healed up, cancer all gone. And then this story kept progressing on this company. And they just demonized every clinical study that they ever did. So they falsified all the results. And so the person kept reading that until the point where he no longer believed that he got the shot of cure and died of lymph node cancer. Just something to put in the back of your head as you start to analyze data as to whether or not you're doing the greater good. Posing a bunch of questions is a very healthy thing to do, for sure. But at some point, you need to kind of come over to the solution side of things. And what I find very interesting is you'll have people who espouse their philosophy, which they can't prove at all. Could be not their fault, because they don't have the machines or the method of doing it. And there's a bunch of people that might believe what they believe, which is why they do it. It just seems logical to them, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you say anything against that theory, they're right after you to say how stupid you are or how you have to produce a bunch of proof. They don't have to reproduce anything. As much as you tell them the proof, they won't let it in the door, because they're just like, well, I know you're wrong. I'm not really interested in you replying because I have a paradigm I'm hanging on to because I'm a skeptic. So, inside the Deep Thoughts University, I think we would have phases in any analysis of data where we all engage in a brainstorming session of skepticism against what we think we have locked down. But it would have to be some significant, in my opinion, amount of contradictory evidence before we would start to modify what we're looking for. But skepticism built into the scientific process, not pop science, but the science we like, is mandatory. You want to make your theories as bulletproof as possible. And so try to be on both sides of the coin is my advice to you, and you'll be a genius. You'll potentially really discover something instead of just espousing something. So anyway, that's the Bermuda Triangle episode. I hope you dug it. I have other episodes in the queue, so we'll see. They're not as cool as these episodes, though. They're more the cerebral kind. I love them, but only some of you do. So anyway, our Deep Thoughts Radio can be found on deepthoughtsradio.com. Please bookmark that page in case we get kicked out. There's a little bit of a conspiracy going on with YouTube right now and this channel. One, we know we're shadow banned. Every video has a peak amount of views that it's allowed to have, and then it gets clobbered down. For instance, the Moon episode is already at 2,000, but I have applied, and just as an experiment, to see if they'll remonetize the channel, just to see what that whole process is like. Inside the qualifications to be remonetized, which I was flying colors, man. When I applied, they show me the statistics. I have to have a certain number of constant subscribers and constant views to be eligible for this evaluation. Well, I've been in evaluation stage now since October 30th. So it's now the middle of December, so it's been a month and a half they can't visit the channel. But what they are doing is they're kicking you guys off subscriptions in 5-pack intervals. The first one they did was 15, then they did 10, and now they're just doing 5s. It's almost like they knew that we're being too obvious about it, and so they've dialed it back to 5s. What they're trying to do is kill our sub count so that I don't qualify just right off the bat. So if you can pass the channel around, if you got Moon people, that's a really good episode to send out to people. Make sure they subscribe, and then we'll kick their butt. At least we won't be disqualified by the standards that they set before the evaluation actually occurs. I'm sure they won't do it anyway, but it's interesting to see how they turn this on right at October, and all through November, they killed us. At the beginning of November, for instance, we had 4,747 subscribers. Within a week, we were down almost below, so the 47 went below 30. And now we went back up to 40-something, and now this morning we're in the mid-30s. It's all in one shot, and it's always in 5-packs. The theory that anyone is jumping off the channel when no videos are being released is pretty suspect, right? If I release a video that's very cerebral and nobody likes it, and 10 people jump off, I get it. They looked at the episode like, yeah, what is this guy talking about? I'm out of here. I don't want to be notified anymore. That makes sense. It's never happened. In BitChute, we're just climbing. So for those of you who ask me, what's your other video channel? It's BitChute. But on the website, we got 2 video, 2 audio, social media. We have an all-new remastered Season 1 that's cleaned up. It's on a different channel because I didn't want to interrupt the count on this one, as I always say. We have a store with a brand new Season 6 shirt. I got a whole new theme that's coming out where you're going to be able to get some Deep Thoughts University shirts. So have some fun with that. I might even reprise it back to the previous seasons so you can say you've been in the university from when it originally started. For those of you that come watch the videos all the time, thank you so much. For those of you on Patreon, thank you so much. We've had donations on PayPal and Patreon, and it really helps during 2020. So thank you so much. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.